sure is hot. About 20 years ago, there was an old man in his 90s walking down the streets of home, right in the middle of the summer. July, maybe early August. The sun was just about noon high. He was walking down toward where the People's Bank of Mullins is, or kind of coming down Main Street toward the mosque before you turn right there. That old Wyoming hotel would have been a fine, fine place in those days. Here he's walking down through there. He pulls a handkerchief out of his back pocket. Now, in those days, he had a handkerchief for many reasons, one of which was to wipe sweat off your brow. That was only one of which. All men and a lot of women carry them in the back pocket at all times. You've seen them, big red ones or blue. I usually wear one around my head now. It's about the only thing I do with it. But he had it, and he wiped his sweat, and he thought, Lord, it sure is hot. And as he did that, it kind of, being old, he kind of staggered back over against the parking meter, which are gone now. Wiped that sweat again. Man, it sure is hot. Woo! And just like that, Lord, he looked around. He wasn't in Mullins. There was a crowd of people gathered around in a field surrounded by the woods. And it kind of shook him. He chilled a little bit. He thought, what in the world? And he looked closely. And sure enough, there was a preacher out there amongst those people. And a little casket. And the preacher was preaching, and the sun went straight overhead. And he recognized a little boy standing near the casket. And he walked closer and he went, oh, Lord, I remember this. And he did, as he watched it unfold again. You see, 70 years earlier, maybe 75, he'd been a little boy, and his mom had awakened him around midnight. Said, son, you got to get up. Your best friend just died. And you got to go either over into Slab Fort, get the preacher, because that's the one we want. Or you got to get up and help your dad make a casket. We got to shave some wood, son, because your best friend died. And we got to get him in the ground tomorrow, because it sure is hot. And he said he remembered that like it was yesterday. And sure enough, he remembered sitting there, standing there by that little casket, as that preacher just kept preaching and preaching and preaching. And he felt a little bit guilty, because here his best friend had died, and about the only thing he could think about was, Lord, preacher, hurry up, it sure is hot. Hurry, please hurry. Kept sweating, and that preacher was preaching. He'd wipe the sweat, he'd preach some more. He'd wipe that sweat about every third sentence. And about every third time he wiped the sweat off his own head, that guy said, he'd reach down and he'd wipe the sweat off that little boy in the casket. And oh, Lord, he staggered back and he was in Mullins again. He was freezing to the core of his soul. Because it took him 70 or 80 years to realize what he should have seen that day. Little boys in caskets who are dead don't sweat. Oh my God, they had done buried his friend alive. And no doubt they had. You know, they didn't embalm him. How'd they check you were dead? I don't hear his heart. Put a mirror on your nose. I don't see any fog on the mirror. He's not 98.6. No, you know, he's probably passed out in a coma and he's 92, 93 or something. They didn't know, and they buried you. Oftentimes, he got buried alive. In fact, a couple things you know about that. You've read stories where they dig you up, they pull you out of a mausoleum 5 years later and discover that you halfway swallowed through the wood because you came to. They even have a term for it. Most of you think it's a sports term from boxing. It's called Saved by the Bell. You know, the guy went down, they start counting to 10 to get him out. On the count of 7, the bell rings. You're saved by the bell. That's not where it came from. Because when they'd bury him, in the old days, before they embalmed him, tie a little string around his neck, run it through a hole in the casket, up to a little post beside the grave, put a little bell on it. And for 24 hours, somebody had to be in range to hear that bell. Why? Because if you had made the mistake and buried them alive, and they came to, they'd obviously struggle around, and that bell would ring. They'd run out there and dig you up, and you were saved by the bell. That's where the term came from. Well, that old man told that story to a guy who was prosecuting an attorney at the time of this county, and that prosecuting attorney at the time was a man named Todd Houck, Dewey, who you know well. My guess is Todd is your nephew?
Second cousin.
Second cousin. So he's not your... His dad is your...
My dad's
brother, right? Okay.
No, his dad's
first
cousin.
Okay. But that's the story. Now, I decided to go look into that because I collect ghost stories. So I went over to the park where that little boy was buried. I sat there at midnight under a full moon. I sat there in the heat of the day in August. And I never, ever had a ghost experience with that little boy, nor have I ever heard of anyone else doing it. And that old man didn't tell that story to say it was a ghost story. Just about what happened in the old days when we didn't have a lot of technology to help us know things.